Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Devil's Gentleman, Privilege, Poison, and the Trial That Ushered in the 20th Century, by Harold Schechter, narrated by Runnette. Prologue. Sing Sing, February 1900. At the start of the 20th century, death by electricity was a relatively recent form of capital punishment. It was only in June 1888 that New York became the first state to pass a law replacing hanging with electrocution. 2 years later, on August 6, 1890, a 30-year-old axe murderer named William Kemmler became the first man to die in the chair. After being hooked up to the apparatus, Kemmler was hit with a high-voltage charge lasting 17 seconds. When the shock failed to kill him, the switch was thrown again. This time the current was kept on for more than a minute. As Kemmler roasted, the room filled with the stench of burning hair and flesh. Some witnesses vomited, while others fainted or fled in horror. Over the succeeding decade, more than 36 criminals were put to death in New York by the new, presumably more humane, mode of execution. All were men. That particular gender barrier was broken in March 1899 when a hard-bitten housewife named Martha Place became the first female to be killed in the chair. In the weeks leading up to her electrocution, her case became a cause célèbre. Even while reveling in the lurid details of her crime, Mrs. Place had smothered her 17-year-old stepdaughter after flinging sulfuric acid in the girl's face. The New York Journal, William Randolph Hearst's wildly sensationalistic yellow paper, crusaded for clemency on the grounds of her sex. The effort proved unavailing. Governor Theodore Roosevelt refused to commute her sentence, declaring that, when it came to punishment, female criminals deserved equality with men. On the morning of March 20th, 1899, clutching a psalm book and muttering, "Lord save me, Lord save me," Mrs. Place was led to the death chair, becoming a pioneer of sorts in the women's rights movement. 11 months later, during the second week of February 1900, the Sing Sing death house received a convicted murderer whose notoriety outstripped even that of the infamous Mrs. Place. His name was Roland Molineux, and largely thanks to the feverish attentions of Hearst and his fellow scandal-mongerer Joseph Pulitzer, his case had riveted the country for more than a year. At the time of his transfer to Sing Sing, he had already spent 12 months in the city prison known as the Tombs. Since his arrest in early 1899, his clean-favored face had grown pasty, and his athlete's physique had lost much of its muscular tone. Still, at 34 years old, he cut a striking figure. Even behind bars, he was never less than immaculately dressed, grooming himself each morning as though preparing to visit his club. Unfailingly suave, if not supercilious, in manner, he bore himself at all times like a gentleman of the highest rank. Throughout his trial, the longest at that time in the history of New York State, he had barely been able to conceal his ennui. For a man convicted of what his accusers called the greatest crime of the age, he struck observers as a marvel of nonchalance. Once immured in the death house, an environment so grim that, by comparison, the Tombs seemed like a Newport hotel, he managed to maintain his unflappable air. At least in the beginning. Within weeks of his arrival, however, something happened that shook even Roland Molineux's remarkable aplomb. Among the other inmates on death row was a 37-year-old Italian immigrant named Antonio Ferraro. A year and a half earlier, in September 1898, Ferraro had bumped into a one-time friend, Luciano Macchio, on a Brooklyn street corner. Macchio was overdue in repaying some cash he had borrowed from Ferraro, and before long the two were hurling insults into each other's face. The words grew uglier. Knives were drawn. Within minutes, Macchio lay dying on the sidewalk, a gaping wound in his throat. Convicted and sentenced to die, Ferraro pinned his last hopes on an appeal. Late on the afternoon of February 23, 1900, however, he received word that the effort had failed and his execution would take place within the week. Ferraro did not take the news well. As one paper reported, he emitted a prolonged scream that broke in fearful violence on the silence of the death house and terrified the other prisoners. For a half-hour the hopeless man shrieked hysterically and rushed around the cell, moaning and shouting curses. Though his priest, Father Oresti Zalucci, eventually managed to calm him down a bit, Ferraro spent the next few days intermittently bursting into inhuman howls or spewing fearful blasphemies. Even on the morning of his execution, Monday, February 26th, Ferraro was still violently protesting his fate. The curtains had been drawn in front of the other condemned cells so that Roland could only see shadows. But he could hear Father Alucci say, "Do you forgive your enemies?" Ferraro answered with a bitter curse. "But you must," Father Alucci pleaded as he walked beside the doomed man. "Say yes, for God's sake. Say yes. You must, or God will not." By then the priest was weeping. "No," shrieked Ferraro. "No, no." That cry of maddened refusal was the last Roland heard of Ferraro. In another moment the condemned man was led into the execution chamber. Later, Roland heard that it had taken 5 separate jolts of electricity to kill Ferraro. He had died, according to the New York Times, harder than any man who has so far died in the electric chair. Roland was so badly rattled that for days afterward he found it hard to eat or sleep. Gradually, however, he recovered his composure. What, after all, did he have to fear? His father had vowed to win his freedom and bring him safely home. And if anyone could be counted on to keep his word, it was General Edward Leslie Molineux, who throughout his long and celebrated life had maintained a moral stance as upright as his posture, a man for whom the concepts of duty, honor, and justice were nothing less than sacred, however quaint and outmoded they might seem to his son. Part 1. The Soldier and the Clubman. Chapter 1. On July 15, 1852, Edward Leslie Molineux, still 3 months shy of his 19th birthday, began what he called his scrapbook. It was not a pasted-in collection of newspaper and magazine clippings, though in later years, when his own name began to appear regularly in the press, he would assemble several of those, too. Rather, this ledger-sized volume was a handwritten miscellany of striking facts, inspirational sayings, and practical information on everything from military tactics to medicinal recipes. There is nothing remotely confessional to be found in this journal. His book has all the introspective quality of the official Boy Scout manual, which it resembles in its single-minded emphasis on self-improvement and the cultivation of the higher civic virtues, industry, tolerance, charity, and a keen sense of duty to one's country. The very look of the pages, inscribed in a flawless hand, perfectly free of blots or corrections, and meticulously labeled with solemn headlines, the importance of physical exercise, useful rules, maxims for the wise, speaks vividly of the young writer's capacity for self-discipline, concentrated effort, and high moral seriousness. "Be virtuous in mind and body, and let your thoughts be pure," he counsels himself in an early entry labeled Rules for Living. This injunction is followed by a score of precepts designed to promote physical, mental, and moral soundness. Use dumbbells twice a day. Bathe every morning. Always get up when you first awake, no matter what time it is. 1 hour in the morning is worth 2 at night. Do everything in a cool, active, and energetic manner. In times of danger or trouble, first think, then act coolly and decisively. Never be idle, always have something to do. Never shrink from an unpleasant duty. Persevere. Never give up a thing until you have tried it every possible way. Perseverance is the best school for every manly virtue. Never be prejudiced, nor allow yourself to be led by others. If you are in the wrong, acknowledge it frankly. Harden in every possible way your body, but not your conscience. Give up all bad habits. Use no slang language. Speak kindly. Be truthful. Be truly polite. In studying, concentrate your thoughts solely upon the subject before you. Be charitable in thought as well as action. Love your God, and read his doctrines, and fail not to address him night and morning. Elsewhere in the journal, he transcribes the rules laid down by Benjamin Franklin as a prescription for happiness and success. Eat not to dullness, avoid trifling conversation, waste nothing, let all things have their place, use no hurtful deceit, tolerate no uncleanness in body, clothes, or habitation, and so on. Fascinated by every aspect of warfare, he fills his journal with extensive notes, often accompanied by his own diagrams and hand-drawn maps, on a sweeping array of military matters: the proper construction of field fortifications, the organization of the Hungarian army, the strategic deployment of troops in the Battle of Waterloo. At the same time, he had a lifelong love of poetry. He read Chaucer and Milton for pleasure, and had a boundless admiration for the writings of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He came honestly by his love of reading. His father, William, was a printer, his mother, Maria Leslie, a remarkably intelligent woman who took great delight in reading French and German, and was also a close student of English and American literature. Young Edward's enthusiasm for all things military was also a family legacy. His ancestors included soldiers who had taken part in the Norman invasion, fought alongside King Henry V at Agincourt, been slain on the battlefield during the War of the Roses, and received personal commendations for bravery from Henry VIII. It was, and is, a proud and ancient line, whose origins can be traced to one Robert de Moulins, the son, according to family legend, of Abelard and Eloise. At the time of Edward's birth, in October 1833, his father still retained the traditional spelling of his last name, Molineux, Molyneux. It was only 2 years later, when William brought his wife and 8 surviving children to the United States, that he adopted the somewhat less exotic-looking spelling Molineux. Though the historical record is hazy, indications are that they settled in Manhattan, where William opened a print shop on the corner of Ann and Nassau Streets, and where 2 years later the Molyneux's youngest child, Arthur, just 22 months old, died and was laid to rest in the vault of the Methodist Church on First Street. William himself died in 1857 at the age of 68. By then, he was no longer living with his wife and children. Exactly what caused this estrangement is a mystery, though given the stigma attached to broken marriages in those days, the reasons could not have been trivial. What is known is that by 1851 William was separated from his family and living on Staten Island. Maria and the children, in the meantime, had moved to the Fort Greene neighborhood of Brooklyn, where Edward Leslie Molineux would reside for the remainder of his long and eventful life. At 17, Edward was a handsome youth, brown-haired, blue-eyed, whose erect, aristocratic carriage made him seem taller than his 5 feet 3 inches. He had been educated at the Mechanics' School on Broadway and Park Place. Despite its name, the Mechanics' School was not a vocational institution. Run by the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, it provided a tuition-free general education to the children of its members at a time before New York City had a municipal public school system. As the son of a printer, Edward was eligible for admission. That year, 1851, 17-year-old Edward found a job at the paint manufacturing firm of Daniel F. Tiemann and Company, whose owner was active in New York City politics and would eventually serve a 2-year term as mayor. Within this bustling concern, young Edward, with his brains, ambition, and indefatigable energy, thrived. In the manner of a Horatio Alger hero, he quickly rose to a position of responsibility, handling all of the firm's voluminous correspondence and occupying the front office with several other clerks. In 1854, even as Edward continued to establish himself in business, and, partly through his association with Daniel F. Tiemann, involve himself in city politics, the 20-year-old Molineux commenced what would be a long and illustrious military career. On June 15th of that year, he enlisted in the New York State Militia as a member of the Brooklyn City Guard, a celebrated light artillery company whose smartly executed drills and dress parades had inspired a popular parlor tune, the Brooklyn City Guard Quick Step. The few extant records from this period in Edward's life show how quickly he advanced through the non-commissioned ranks. No surprise, given his ferocious drive and exceptional abilities. In 1858, when the U.S. government needed a courier for an important diplomatic mission to Venezuela, the Department of State chose Edward, who discharged his duties with his usual professional grace. It was not long after his return in January 1859 that he was introduced to Hattie Davis Clark of East Hartford, Connecticut. Exactly where and under what circumstances they met is unknown, as are all the details of their courtship. By the following December, however, they were betrothed. That Christmas, Edward gave her an illustrated volume of Schiller's poetry, inscribed, "To Hattie, from Ned." For the emotionally reserved, unremittingly proper Molineux, his use of his pet name, employed only by his family and closest friends, was a mark of the intimacy that had developed between them. In the meantime, he continued to make himself indispensable to his employers, so much so that in 1860 he was made a partner in the firm. Business was bad for the Tiemans, however. Most of their customers were Southern merchants, and sales fell off dramatically as tensions rose between the North and South following the election of Abraham Lincoln in November. In late December of that year, Edward began a new journal, this one composed of his own philosophical musings. One of the earliest entries is dated January 1861. Titled "The First Day of the New Year," it is written in Molyneux's loftiest style, full of high-minded sentiments about opportunities afforded by the coming year, to correct past errors, to cultivate new virtues, to accomplish greater things. It is not until the end of the essay that the 27-year-old deals directly with the momentous events of the day and their immediate implications for his own happiness and well-being. Here the tone becomes deeply affecting, as he contemplates two radically different futures, and girds himself to face the worst with his usual courage, honor, and gallantry. "And for myself, how far in this year of 1861 I may proceed, God alone knows, for who can tell what this eventful year may bring forth? If to happiness and peace, all thanks to the Almighty, but if plain visible duty points to the other path, where men's passions rage, and where patriotism demands us to defend principles and secure future happiness at the bitter price of present suffering, danger, and if needs be, life itself, then let me rise superior to all considerations in defense of the right, and let me recollect that His hand is above me, and let my foot be firm to do His will." It didn't take long for Edward Molineux to learn what the future held. On April 12, 1861, less than 4 months after he penned his New Year's essay, Confederate forces under General Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. On July 18, 1861, Edward Molineux and Hattie Davis Clark were married in her hometown of East Hartford. 3 days later, Union forces were routed by the Confederate Army at Manassas, ending the fond hopes of Northerners that the war would be over in a matter of months. With his army shattered, Lincoln signed bills calling for the enlistment of 500,000 additional troops and extending the term of service from 90 days to 3 years. By then, Edward Molineux himself was back in uniform as a major of the 11th Brigade of the New York National Guard. A few months later, he was authorized to organize a regiment designated as the 159th. After several weeks of training at a camp on Staten Island, Edward and his men set out from New York City aboard the United States steamer Northern Light. On December 14th, they joined a large fleet of transports at Ship Island, Mississippi, before proceeding up the river into enemy country. During his 3 years of active duty, Edward would participate in campaigns from the Louisiana bayous to the Shenandoah Valley and take part in more than a dozen battles. Following the fall of Savannah, he would be placed in charge of the city's fortifications, and after Lee's surrender, be appointed military commander of the District of Northern Georgia with his headquarters in Augusta. All of these duties and more he performed with grace, valor, and an unswerving sense of decency that won him the gratitude of his government, the love of his men, and even the respect of his adversaries. His energies seemed inexhaustible. At the height of the war, it was nothing for him to spend nearly 24 hours in the saddle, return to his tent for 3 hours of sleep, then rise at dawn and conduct drills for another 12 hours before attending to regimental paperwork. Stern as he could be when circumstances warranted it, Molineux was beloved by his troops for the fatherly care he demonstrated. His letters home are filled with requests for small gifts for his men, everything from candy and tobacco to stockings and sewing kits. At other times he does what he can to relieve their anxieties about their loved ones back home. But it wasn't just Edward's concern for their welfare that endeared him to his men. It was his gallantry as a warrior. And nowhere was that courage, or the devotion it inspired, more dramatically in evidence than in the bloody engagement known as the Battle of Irish Bend. On the morning of April 14th, 1863, the 159th, along with several other regiments, was ordered to make a bayonet charge across a muddy sugar field to drive a force of rebel soldiers from a dense strip of woods. Edward, on horseback, was in the lead. The field was so heavily plowed, however, that his horse kept stumbling in the furrows, and he quickly dismounted. Charging ahead on foot, Edward and his troops came under a ferocious crossfire from the Confederates, who were entirely concealed behind fences, canebrakes, and trees. As he turned to shout encouragement to his men, Edward saw that they were being cut down by the score. Calling a halt, he ordered them to take cover in the ditch-like furrows and open fire. Under this fusillade, the enemy gunfire slackened a bit. Edward saw a chance to cover the remaining ground. Leaping to his feet, he called out, "Forward, New York!" No sooner had he shouted the words than his face exploded in pain, and he was hurled to the ground. A rifle ball had torn through his mouth, blasting away the gums and teeth on the left side and exiting his cheek. Edward struggled to his feet and tried to urge his men forward, but as he reported in a letter to his family, "I could not make myself understood, and some stupid fool gave an order to retreat." At that moment, the rebels on their flank came charging upon them. Edward told his men to save themselves, but they would not leave him. "Such self-sacrificing fellows I never knew of," he declared. 4 of them were struck by musket balls, one through the forehead, while carrying him to safety. Within days, Edward hastened to assure his family that his wound was nothing. "It is ugly and painful, but not dangerous," he wrote. For the rest of the war, Edward suffered from severe, at times incapacitating, headaches, which he attempted to treat with homeopathic remedies supplied by his mother. Despite these bouts of illness, he carried on as steadfastly as ever, sustained by his absolute belief in the righteousness of the Northern cause. His military service came to an end on July 29, 1865, when he tendered his resignation. When he departed for home 3 days later, he did so with the rank of Major General by brevet, for gallant and meritorious service during the war. After 3 grueling years, during which he had conducted himself with unwavering dignity and courage, Edward Leslie Molineux was returning to his family to enjoy a life of peace, prosperity, and enduring honor. Or so he had every reason to expect. General Edward Leslie Molineux was not a man to rest on his laurels. Possessed of superabundant energies, in the word of one awestruck observer, he lost no time in throwing himself into a wide range of activities, from business and politics to military affairs and civic enterprises. Shortly after his return to Brooklyn, he had a falling out with his employer and patron, Daniel Tiemann, and left to join a rival firm, C.T. Reynolds, which he soon helped transform into the largest paint-making concern in the country. It would later merge with another company, F.W. DeVoe. He commanded a division of the New York State National Guard, was a founding member of the National Rifle Association, embarked on a campaign to make military instruction a standard part of the public school curriculum, lectured and wrote papers on the suppression of riots, helped organize the Union Veterans Patriotic League, served as a trustee of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences, became the first president of the New York Paint and Coatings Association, and played an active role in local politics. Then there were the numberless Civil War ceremonies, the regimental reunions, the anniversary receptions, the memorial services, the veterans' dinners, the concerts and picnics and parades. For Edward, however, the most meaningful occasions were the reunions of survivors of the 159th. During one of these he was presented with a specially made badge emblazoned with the image of a bear, the proud symbol of his beloved regiment. In a moving speech, his old friend and comrade-in-arms Frank Tiemann testified to the filial regard his soldiers felt toward the man who was, in every sense, the father of his regiment, a manly man, a gallant soldier, and a true friend. By the same token, for as long as he lived, Edward would always refer to the men of the 159th as family. His actual family, especially his children, consistently expressed the same veneration for him. Given his repute as a manly man, it seems fitting that Edward Leslie Molineux sired only boys. There was the oldest son, Leslie Edward, born in 1862, who, mirroring his father, would prosper in business, serve as an officer in the army, and try his hand at politics, running unsuccessfully for governor of New Jersey as the Prohibition Party candidate in 1934. There was the youngest son, Cecil Sefton, born in 1876, who, also like his father, would have a successful career in a paint company and involve himself in various patriotic organizations, most notably the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States. And then there was the middle son, Roland Burnham Molineux, born in 1866, whose notoriety would far outstrip his father's fame, and who, at a time when Edward should have been enjoying an honorable old age, would turn the family name into a byword for scandal, depravity, and cold-blooded murder. Chapter 2. Given their father's fervent belief in the importance of childhood exercise, it is hardly surprising that the Molineux boys were pushed to develop their bodies as well as their minds. All three grew into fine figures of young manhood, but Roland in particular matured into a superb physical specimen. He seemed fashioned by nature for gymnastics, with a lithe, compact frame, exceptional coordination, and a ferociously competitive spirit that even in his adolescence burned beneath a carefully cultivated mask of upper-class hauteur. His specialty was the horizontal bar. With the tenacity inherited from his father, he spent countless hours at the gymnasium, perfecting acrobatic moves, somersaults, twists, and spectacular dismounts that dazzled onlookers. In 1882, shortly before his 16th birthday, Roland was pulled from the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, where, like his brothers, he was sent to study chemistry in preparation for a career in the paint business, and shipped out west. Little is known about this interlude in Roland Molineux's life, since the reasons for his sudden removal were kept secret from all but his closest relatives. According to some later accounts, he spent the time working on a ranch. In 1884, his father traveled west to fetch him home. His 2 years of rugged living had added muscle to Roland's already well-knit physique. Back home, he lost no time in returning to his former life, earning his high school equivalency while throwing himself into the city's flourishing athletic scene. 1 year later, in 1885, at a competition sponsored by the New York Athletic Club, he won the first of several national titles, becoming the amateur horizontal bar champion. To be an amateur sporting champion was no small distinction in 1885. In the decades since Edward Leslie Molineux published a widely reprinted essay deploring the physical deterioration of the American race and calling for mandatory military and gymnastic exercises in the public schools, the country had been seized by what one contemporary observer called a passion for athletic sports. It was an era that witnessed a nationwide mania for bicycling, a craze for physical culture, and the birth of modern sports writing. When baseball became the national pastime, A.G. Spaulding grew rich peddling sporting goods and guidebooks to the public, and heavyweight title bouts received the kind of frenzied front-page coverage formerly reserved for Civil War battles and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?